Michael Levin as Mikey because he was a camper at Ramah.
Oh my.
And he wasn't in my bunk, my cabin, when I was on staff, but I worked with him and his age group and his friends many times. And he was known at Ramah at camp because he had shpilkus. He couldn't sit still. He was always unsettled. He was often just a little on edge or unhappy, and he went through camp, and camp was a very good environment and supportive to him. But he always had this sort of unsettled piece of him. And I didn't see him for many years after, several years after he finished going through the entire camp cycle. And I saw him again after he had made Aliyah, and several of you have commented on the sandwich shop New Delhi. And I was there with a couple of congregants from Detroit, and all of a sudden this guy, now Mikey had always been the sort of pipsqueak in the bunch, right? This enormous guy came up behind me and gave me the type of hug where you sort of can't appreciate it anymore because you're not breathing. And I turned around, and he was no longer able to be called Mikey. Let's just put it that way. Michael Levin, who had made Aliyah and had joined the paratroopers and was at that time what we call a chayal boded, which means a lone soldier, a soldier that does not have family in Israel, but is then in many ways by the army and the whole country embraced because of that. So he was a paratrooper. He was on, just a night out in Jerusalem, and he gives me this huge hug. We talk for just a few minutes, and he goes on his way. And I remember thinking, here's this guy who couldn't sit still for a second, this kid, and now he's this huge man who is defending Israel, and all I could think of is, man, has he found his place? He was so settled. He was so sure of who he was in a way that I had never seen in him, and he had really come into his own, and it was just so great to see that. And I was just thrilled about that. And I remarked to a couple of other Ramah alumni, Ramah Poconos alumni, I saw Mikey and he looks great, he's doing great. That summer was 2006, and it was the Second Lebanon War. And one of the things that happens with chayalim bodedim, lone soldiers, is that their leave is sort of accumulated in a way that they can then go and visit their family. Harriet and Mark are his parents. And so he was home for a little bit when the war broke out, and immediately he said, I gotta go back, it's time for me to serve. And his commander said, look, it's okay, you're home with your family, you'll come up to the front when you were supposed to come back, it's no big deal. He refused. He got on the next plane, kissed his mother and father, much like Ruvain described about on a Sunday morning. He kissed his mother and father and went into war. And sadly, shortly thereafter, in a firefight in southern Lebanon, he lost his life. He died on the 7th of Av. And when, of course, none of us can even imagine what that's like to, from afar, the parents being contacted to say, you have to come to Israel now to bury your child. And so they arrived, Mark and Harriet, in Israel on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, a traditional day of mourning, which was to be the burial. And they were taken here to Mount Herzl. And as Harriet tells the story, they didn't know what was going to happen. They had even had a conversation as to whether he should be buried. There was the option, of course, for him to be buried in Philadelphia where they could visit him. And she herself said, this is where he was, this is where he wanted to be, this was his home, this is where he found that sense of being settled. He'll be buried on Mount Herzl. So they get to Israel, and they sort of assumed, he's a Chayal Boded. They'll get up there and they'll do what they need to do. It'll be a terrible day, one of the worst days in their life, I'm sure, and they'll just go home, and that'll be it. But there was a problem, because there was a tremendous amount of traffic, and they assumed maybe it was part of Tisha B'Av. It's not really a day to remember. There's a Yom HaZikaron, there's an Israel Memorial Day for soldiers who have fallen, but they said maybe that's what it is. It was a very hot day, but it was just almost impossible to get up to the site of the burial. And they eventually made their way through, and finally, even though she was, of course, only thinking of her son, finally Harriet and Mark, they said, well, what is going on here today? They asked someone, and someone in the crowd turned around and said, as a Chayal Boded who lost his life, Michael Levin. And there was a concern that there wouldn't be a minyan for Kaddish to bury him. And so from around the country, busloads of people had come to Mount Herzl for the funeral.
Oh my goodness.
And she turned and she said, I am the mother of that Chayal Boded. And of course the crowd parted and allowed her to come forward, and his comrades literally buried him. They did the burial as often is the case in Israel. So in his memory and as a tribute, a couple of things have happened. First of all, if you've heard of the Michael Levin Lone Soldier organization, they continue to offer tribute to his memory by supporting lone soldiers who are in the army here in Israel. But she tells this story, Harriet and Mark, they tell this story over and over and over again. The first time that I had the opportunity to be here and break away from a group to visit after his burial was a couple years later. And when I wanted to go the first time, on my own before I was with a group. And so I went, and I was just sort of scouting it out, and I saw a group of Israeli teenagers come around here, and one came, a group, and they saw me sort of standing here, and they asked who I was, and I said, I told them a little bit of how I knew Mikey, and they laughed because the idea of Mikey, right, for them, here's this hero, right, and I said, I just wanted to be here because I didn't know who visited his grave, but here you see all of this Philly sports paraphernalia, which has become a custom to place here because he was a huge Philly sports fan, so here you can pass this stuff and place something. And I said I didn't know who was going to be here, and I wanted to just be able to say to his parents, who I see periodically in Philadelphia, that I was, here. And so the group leader of this group of teens said to me, Tagid lehorav, tell his parents, Tamid yesh mivakrim lekever shel Mikey. Always there are people, Israelis, who come in and visit this grave. It's never alone. It's never what they had feared by burying him here, that they would come, they would do the burial, and that would be it. On that day, on Tisha B'Av, it was packed with tens of thousands of people, and ever since there have been groups that come through here and visit here and tell his story and tell of his sacrifice. And so that group, I always take a picture when I'm here of the group that's here, and I email it to Harriet and Mark. But But then another group came, and I said Kaddish with them, to have yet another minyan to make sure there was a minyan to say Kaddish at his grave. I thought, in addition to, in a moment, placing, certainly you can place stones, but placing sports paraphernalia, I thought we should say just a quick prayer here, not just for Mikey, because he would not have it that way, but for all the Jewish heroes whose sacrifice is what has made this dream not a dream but a reality. So on the inside panel we'll say, I'll just say the Hebrew and we can say the English together, in memory of Israel's heroes throughout history. We'll do the El Malei Rachamim and the Kaddish.